Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in to today's video. We're doing the Autumn Analogues Part 2 video today. So a couple of weeks ago we had a look at some autumn analogues. We was looking at autumns that were La Nina autumns, but with the caveat that those coming out of an El Nino event. We had a big El Nino event at the start of 2016, start of this year of course. We've unravelled that. We're back to neutral. Almost borderline La Nina, but not quite there. So what we did for the analogues update a couple of weeks ago was had a look at autumns that were La Nina autumns, but with caveat that they had come out of an El Nino event. This update is going to have a look at autumns that are ENSO neutral, but again with the caveat that they've come out of a preceding El Nino. So there's many examples of just ENSO neutral autumns. We've narrowed that criteria down to be more specific to this year, which is that ENSO neutral, but coming out of El Nino. I hope you're bearing with me. So we're going to have a look at those analogues. There's quite a few of them to get through. Quite a long video. We're going to start with a recap of the first analogues update we did a couple of weeks ago. That we're looking at those La Nina autumns. But before I get on with that, just to say about the ads. There's links to articles on all the pages. If you have a browser with you, so click through the links. You'll be having us to pay for our website. And thanks so much for doing that. There's video ads, most pages, which own that content. When you watch them, they close back up again. And it's all helping to pay for GazWebbies.com. So thanks so much for getting involved. And thank you for doing that. Big thank you, talking of thanks, big thank you to James Ackrill for sending these analogues through to us. He sent the first lot of analogues through for the La Nina autumns, sent this lot of analogues through for the ENSO neutral autumn. So big thank you to James. I know you'll be watching, James, and thanks so much for allowing us to use your charts. Just say it can be quite a long video, a lot of analogues to get through. So if you can't watch it all in one go, don't worry, this will be placed on the autumn updates page where you can come back and watch it whenever you want. There'll also be a written post that goes with this on the autumn updates page, which will be added later on today. The first analogues update is there as well, so you want to recap. I'm going to quick talk about it at the start of the video, but if you want a quick recap on the first autumn analogues update, head to the autumn updates page and it's there with that written post. And just say very exciting developments later on today, because Terry Scoley, our good friend Terry, who normally does month-end forecasts, going to have some autumn thoughts ahead for you on his page, probably later on this afternoon. So keep an eye out for that and see what Terry is expecting for the autumn of 2016. Right, let's get on with our analogues update then. And just a quick recap really on the last update, the first analogues update. So we're looking at those years that were going from El Nino at the start of the year to La Nina by the autumns. And we broke them down into pre-1950 and post-1950. So, for example, we've got 1878 going all the way down to 1942, but the for the pre-1950 analogues, and then we'll have a look at the other analogues in a moment. But it was a signal for quite a bit of northern blocking actually in the first half of the 20th century back into the Victorian era. Did see quite a lot of above average heights here with these La Nina autumns with a trough underneath. Not a particularly wet signal, fairly dry signal, but quite a coldish signal, I think, these El Nino to La Nina autumns. And then we've got the second half of the 20th century. So the analogues here, we're going from 1954 down to 2010. Excuse me. And it's a rather different setup that we have for these autumns. Generally, still quite a bit of dry, still a fairly dry signal, but the ridge, instead of being centred over the pole, it's centred more down into the Atlantic and just to our west. It does go up to Greenland to some degree, but the centre of it is actually to our west. Trough around Scandinavia, so a fairly cold signal for them. And generally just the jet stream doing something like that. So a lot of dry weather. It's blocking off the Atlantic. The Atlantic trough is well away in the central part of the Atlantic Ocean, just there. So fairly dry signal still, whichever part of the 20th century we look at, but it's not such a cool signal as we have in the first half of the 20th century, quite interestingly. So that's how the analogues were looking for the first update when we did the El Nino to La Nina years. And if you want to know more about it, just check out the video and written post on the autumn updates page. Now we'll get on with those years that are going from El Nino to ENSO neutral and see what those autumns look at. Again, we're going back into the 1800s to start off with, and we're going to start off in the year 1886. I think it's starting off in the year 1886, or maybe it's 1866 actually, I'm not sure. I think it's going to be 1886 though. So what we see for this one to start us off is a generally quite Atlantic driven signal this autumn. Trough of low pressure coming through the country. It's a little bit of above average heights around the top of the pole, but nothing really to impact. Generally, that's an unsettled autumn. Jet stream coming through the country rather like that. So it's probably fairly mildish autumn, I would have thought, and quite unsettled as well. Our next year is 1897, and it's in complete contrast to that first year. So the autumn of 1897, which is an ENSO neutral autumn, looks like this, and it's generally a very dry scene. It's got above average heights, more or less centred over the country. The trough of low pressure is well away from us in the Atlantic and also across the eastern part of Europe and into western Russia. So the jet stream here is going rather like that, and it's just a very quiet, very settled, probably not overly cold autumn pattern in 1897. Our next year is 1912, and this is completely different again. So you notice that we're just doing 3 autumns so far, but already there's no discernible trend here. So the autumn of 1912 looks like this. There's a ridge out to our west, quite a weak one, with a deep trough to our east. And again, it's probably not overly wet. It's probably quite cool, this one, but not overly cold. But I would have thought most of the weather is like being the south and the east, and the driest weather is in the north and the west. But again, it's a significantly different pattern to what we just saw in the second year, and again to that first year. 1915 is our next autumn. This one's quite a cold signal, so we've got a lot of blocking over North Pole and a trough of low pressure underneath it. The winds probably coming from an easterly or northeasterly type direction. So that's a colder autumn coming through there in 1915. But it is significantly different to the autumns that preceded it. And again, we go through to 1919 with another really quite different pattern. This one has some ridging around Greenland and more generally down into the Atlantic, and a deep trough then extends through the UK. This is quite a cold signal again for the autumn of 1919. The jet stream is doing something a bit like that. It was a famously cold November in 1919, as it was in 1915, interestingly. So those 2 years look quite cold in terms of these ENSO neutral autumns. Remember though, they're not just ENSO neutral. There'd be too many just plain ENSO neutral autumns. The big point about this is that these are all ENSO neutral autumns that are coming out of an El Nino. The next year is significantly different again. So we don't have a trend here. That's very evident so far up to 1926. And the autumn of 1926 looks like this. Just really, really unsettled. Deep trough of low pressure is centred over UK and northwest Europe. This would be copious amounts of rain. And probably not overly cold. There's no real northern blocking to entrench cold air into that trough. Just a very wet autumn in that year. And then we're different again. Look, this is 1931. when we replaced the trough that we have in 1926 for a ridge in 1931. Fairly weak ridge, but above average height, centred over the UK, so if anything, it's on the drier side. Again, not overly cold either in the autumn of 1931. 1952 possibly takes us back to something colder for this one. We've got ridging around Greenland, south of Greenland, close to Iceland, trough of low pressure generally to our east. That ridging does extend back to some degree anyway towards the top of the pole, and the jet stream is probably going something like that. Actually, that would be a bit wrong. So the jet stream is probably doing something a bit like that. So we're probably placed on the colder side of the jet stream there, actually, for that one. So it looks like quite a cold autumn there in 1952. In fact, I think it was the one of the coldest autumns of the 20th century. So that's interesting, that we have got a notably cold autumn within the Analogues package. And of course, got a couple of colder years before that in 1915 and 1919. So maybe a little bit going towards the side of this being a colder signal, but got many more years to get through yet. And our next year is 1959, the autumn of 1959, looking like this, coming out of the El Nino event of 58-59. It's ENSO neutral for the autumn of 1959. It's a lot of ridging. The ridging this time generally centred towards Scandinavia, and this is quite a mild autumn, actually. The jet stream and the low pressure going down here, but we're pulling up generally the air from a southeasterly type direction, particularly through the early part of this autumn. So the autumn of 1952 is an El Nino to ENSO neutral autumn, and it's really quite a cold one. The autumn of 1959 is an El Nino to ENSO neutral autumn, and this is a much milder pattern. So again, I don't think we've got a discernible trend at this stage. We go through to 1966. This looks very wet. Autumn 1966 places a ridge well away from us in the Atlantic. I mean, a trough is running through the country. So that looks quite a wet autumn, I would have thought, with the jet stream doing something rather unusual, doing something like that. So quite cold and wet, perhaps, for the autumn of 1966. 1978 is next, and this one again is significantly different. So this one places a ridge more or less over the UK with lots of low pressure to the north. It's a very mild autumn in 1978, with the jet stream generally running to the north of the country until the very end of November, when it turned much, much colder right at the death of November in the final week. Had a blast of early winter weather, setting the scene, that cold winter, 78, 79. But the actual autumn itself of 1978 was very mild and very dry autumn. 1980 is the next autumn that James has sent through, and again it's different once more. This one has high pressure around Greenland, low pressure around Scandinavia, and pretty northerly autumn, quite a cold autumn in 1980. 1983 is next, coming out of a Super Nino of 82-83. We just went to ENSO neutral in the autumn 1983. Spoke about 1983 before because that's perhaps a year that's quite close to us, although I'll just speak about this a little bit. We're not having a hot summer at this stage. Still time to go for August to warm up, but at this stage we're not having the hot summer that we had in 1983. Nevertheless, the way the teleconnections are setting up, 1983 could be the closest year to the current scenario, in that we have a big El Nino, a Super Nino at the start of the year, but rather than unravelling and going to La Nina, as you would normally expect, it just goes to ENSO neutral. Pacific also in quite a warm state, as it was in 1983 as well. So 1983 could be a fairly close year to the current scenario. So that INSO-neutral autumn of 1983 looks like this. It's different again. There is no discernible trend here, I don't think, with these analogues. So we just have a lot of ridging around west of Europe, a deep trough into north of Scandinavia, and the jet stream is doing something a bit like that. Fairly mild and quite dry autumn, that one. 1992 is next, and this one is different again. The autumn of 1992 looking like this, with a trough of low pressure close to us and high pressure down around the Azores. So it's quite a westerly autumn, albeit fairly wet and unsettled. So quite unsettled and fairly wet westerly type autumn. 2003 is next. After that baking hot summer of 2003, the autumn looks like this. And it's different again, isn't it? This has a lot of above average heights, very odd looking charts, really. A lot of above average heights all over the place, really, to our east, to our north, to our west. So very dry autumn. And it did get a bit colder in October. I think October 2003 was the only cooler than average month throughout the whole of 2003. So a bit of a cooler October, but generally just a very dry and not overly cold autumn in 2003. And then our final autumn is 2005. This one is different again. This one has above average heights and high pressure backing in towards Scandinavia and Western Russia. And the flow, similar to 1959 in some ways, or to 1955. The flow is generally southeasterly, low pressure in the Atlantic. It was a very mild autumn again in 2005, until the end of November, when it turned quite cold in the second half of November 2005. What is very clear here is that there is no discernible trend through these autumns. So if it is going to be an INSO-neutral autumn, I've got a suspicion it probably will be. If it's going to be an INSO-neutral autumn rather than La Nina autumn, there's no discernible trend, and pretty much any scenario is on the table. I suppose what you could say is that there is generally a little bit of a trend towards higher pressure, above average height, so a lot of these autumns are quite dry. But in terms of what the temperatures are doing, and even there are a fair few really wet autumns in there as well. But in terms of what temperatures are doing, there really is no trend. There's some quite cold autumns, like 1915, 1919, 1952. They're really cold autumns. But equally, there's some very warm autumns. For example, that one I'm just looking at there, 2005. Now, James has attempted to combine all of these autumns into a single analogue. So we go right way back to the very first one in the 1800s, just there, and then we go all the way down to 2005, which is just there. And combining all of these autumns, this is how it comes out, and we generally get a ridge out to our west and troughs to our east. So in some ways, that is similar to the El Nino to La Nina autumns from the first update in the second half of the 20th century, with the flow generally doing something a bit like that. Not a desperately cold signal, fairly dryish signal picked up west of us, wetter to the east. But we're seeing that there's so much inter-year variation here that it probably isn't fair, actually, to create this analogue taking all these autumns combined. It's probably been misleading you to leave you with that. So what James has done is broken this down into various scenarios. So the first scenario is for all of those autumns but just had high pressure close to us, and that comes out very similar to that all years combined chart. So we have the ridge out to the west, the trough is to the east, and it's probably a coolish and dryish type autumn that we get there, with the flow going something like that. So coolish and dryish for those years from 1897 down to 2005. But we've already seen that within that, the position of this ridge, this above average area of heights, is moved around. So, for example, in 2005, it's centered over Scandinavia and Western Russia. Other years, it's centered to our west. So, even within this sort of analog pattern, there's a lot of variation. The next set of years is those years that were cold autumns, had northern blocking, and for those autumns, we come out looking like this, with high pressure to our north and low pressure to our south, and the flow is coming in from the east. Those autumns go from the 1800s again down to 2003. And then finally, the last lot of autumns are those that are westerly and just generally mild and dry autumns, and they look like this. We have high pressure to our south and low pressure up to the north, with the flow going through like that. Aren't as many of these autumns, so we've got 1878, 1983, we've got 1978, I should say. It's been a very long day. 1983 and 1992. Only 3 of those autumns that are sort of westerly zonal type autumns, albeit they're more recent actually. So that's a little bit interesting. And 1983, of course, as I've already explained, is perhaps the year that we're closest to right now in terms of the Super Neo and then going back towards ENSO neutral. There isn't really enough to go on there. I've gone on, how long have I gone on for with this one? I've gone on for 20 minutes. And it's very clear that there is no discernible trend here. So I'm not sure the analogues are going to be a great deal of help if it is going to be ENSO neutral. I've got a suspicion it will be this autumn. There was a much clearer signal for those autumns that were going from El Nino to La Nina, what we had a look at in the first analogues pattern package. For these autumns, the El Nino to ENSO neutral autumns, pretty much all options are on the table, and I suppose what it means is that I've got to look at other drivers perhaps and see what the seasonal models are doing. But it does make it really difficult for me this autumn, because the analogues are not going to be a great deal of help. You would say that perhaps there is a trend towards drier autumns. That does come out, I think, throughout the analogue packages. There are a few really quite wet ones, but generally they're fairly dryish, these autumns. But in terms of a broad pattern, in terms of where the high pressure is sitting, is it to the west, is it to the north, to the east, is it to the south, is it just centred over us? And that has big implications for the temperatures, of course. High pressure to the east can be generally quite a warm autumn until later, but it may get colder. High pressure to the west or to the south, that's going to be quite a mild zonal autumn. So there's a lot of uncertainty there with these analogues. And it's important that we see the uncertainty, of course, because we don't always have the answers. We look at the analogues, try and guide us towards a direction. Sometimes the analogues don't take us in a direction, and they haven't really done for this particular update. And that in itself, when we come to do the autumn forecast at the end of the month, will be an important point to ponder. So on that note, it's quite a confused note, I have to admit, and apologies for that. I hope you found the video interesting and informative and was able to stay with the gist of it. And on that note, at 23 minutes nearly, I'll bid you a very good day. Thanks for tuning in on this Sunday. And come back later on to see what Terry Scoley's got to say about the autumn. Be some really interesting thoughts from Terry in a while. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.